The Duke of Wexford discovered the maid's son hiding under his dining table on the afternoon of his most important luncheon of the year, clutching a single saffron roll and a curl of cheese the boy had not dared to ask for. The reaction of 14 county peers was a long-held breath. The reaction of the Duke himself, when he lifted the corner of the linen and saw the small, grave face looking back at him, was the thing the county would not stop telling for the rest of the year. It was not a shock of anger. It was a shock of an altogether different kind. To understand its shape, you must first understand the table at which it began. The Duke of Wexford had given a luncheon for 14 county peers on the last clear day of October, and the long mahogany table held more silver than the village curate had ever owned. A cold collation had been laid: pressed mutton in jelly, glazed capon, a pyramid of pears, 3 cheeses, and a tower of saffron-tinged rolls. Mrs. Linton had baked since dawn. The Marquis of Brently was speaking. Lord Crews listened with the stillness that meant he was not listening at all. A clock counted out the half-hour, and Adrian, the Duke, who was meant to be hearing his most important guest on the Yorkshire vote, leaned his cheek a fraction toward the linen and heard, quite distinctly, the sound of a small body breathing under his own table. He did not move at once. He let the Marquis finish a sentence about the reform petition. He took a quiet sip of his hock. He set down his glass. Then he lifted the corner of the damask cloth on the side that fell to the floor at his own seat, and he looked beneath the table where, by every right and every long house rule, no one ought to have been. A small boy looked back at him. He was perhaps 6. Clean, fair hair brushed flat with water, a face the color of new milk, and large, round brown eyes, with the still attention of a creature not yet decided whether it has been seen. He wore a dark blue jacket with a carefully mended elbow patch, and breeches that had once belonged to someone larger. He knelt on the polished oak floor, with one hand pressed flat against the leg of the Duke's chair. In the other, he held one of Mrs. Linton's saffron rolls. A small, pale curve of cheese had been pushed into it. He had not bitten it. He had only been holding it, waiting, the Duke understood at once, for the right moment to begin. The Duke of Wexford had been told a great many things in his life. He had been told, at 6, that his name was older than the throne, and that he was not to weep in the corridor where the footman could hear. He had been told, at 12, that a duke's house was a place for great men, and not for small ones. He had been told, at 24, that his father's last hours had been spent counting the silver. He had not been told what to do when, under his own table, on a day when the future of the Yorkshire vote rested on his manners, he found a child with stolen leftovers in one small fist. He lowered the cloth gently and sat up. His thumb pressed once against the signet ring on his left hand, the way it had always done when he did not yet know what he meant to do. Lord Crews, 2 seats down, said, "Wexford, you have gone quite pale. Is the mutton against you?" "The mutton," said the Duke, in a voice no one in the room could have read, "is admirable." He stood. He set his napkin beside his glass with the careful slowness of a man arranging a piece of evidence. The footman at the sideboard began to come forward, mistaking the gesture for a signal. He lifted one finger, and they stopped where they were. "Mrs. Linton," he said, to the housekeeper, who had stepped in at the door at the small change in the air. "Will you bring me a chair, please? A child's chair, if there is one to be had. The carved oak from the morning room will do." Mrs. Linton stood quite still. She was a woman who had served 3 dukes in this house, and who was not, in the ordinary way, ever surprised. "Your Grace," she said. "And a place setting," said the Duke. "Small plate, small cup, and the little silver spoon and fork from the nursery cabinet, if Mrs. Whitford has kept them polished." There was a silence at the table, the like of which the south dining room had not heard in a generation. The Marquis of Brently set down his glass slowly. Lord Crews leaned back in his chair and smiled. The long, thin smile of a man who has just been handed a weapon he had not expected to need. "Wexford," said Lord Crews, What on earth are you about?" The Duke did not answer him. He had crouched, with the grace of a man who has been taught from boyhood that the body of a duke does not bend except in the saddle, and he had lifted the corner of the cloth again. He held out one steady hand to the child beneath the table. "You may come out," said the Duke quietly. "There is room." The child did not come at once. He looked first at the offered hand, and then at the great length of the table above it, and then back at the offered hand. And then, very carefully, he set the roll down on the polished floor between his knees, as if to free himself from any imputation of theft. Then he put his small fingers into the Duke's. The Duke of Wexford had held the hands of dowagers, and the hands of his late mother, and the hand of his father at the last hour. He had not, in any year of his life that he could number, held a child's hand. The fingers were cool and very thin, and did not grip. They only rested there, as if the child were testing whether the bridge would hold. The boy came out. He stood up beside the Duke's chair, 6 years old and perfectly clean and perfectly silent, holding the cheese-laden roll in his free hand and not eating it. The 14 peers of the county of York looked at him. He looked back at none of them. He looked, very quietly, at the polished toe of his own small boot. Mrs. Linton arrived with the morning-room chair. Behind her, in a working gown of dark plum and a white apron tied so quickly that the bow was crooked, was a woman the Duke had not yet learned to look at properly. She was the new under-housemaid, taken on at Michaelmas, Mrs. Sarah Whitford, by the housekeeper's book. He had passed her once on the back stairs and once in the corridor. On both occasions, she had stood aside with her face turned to the wall. He noticed her now, because she had put one hand flat against the doorframe to keep herself upright, and a worn locket chain glinted there at her collar, and her face had gone very pale. "Your Grace," she said, and the word was a curtsy done with the voice. "I beg you. He is mine. He is mine, and the fault is entirely mine, and I—" "Mrs. Whitford," said the Duke. He had spoken the name once, only once that he could remember. She startled at it, as if she had forgotten she still had one. "Will you come in, please, and sit by him? He is not in any trouble. Neither are you." She did not move. The kitchen behind her had gone so still that even the great kettle on its hook had stopped making the small ticking sound it made when it cooled. Lord Crewe leaned forward and said, in the bright, social tone in which he could ruin any reputation in 3 sentences, "Wexford, my dear fellow, you cannot mean to seat the boy. The boy is a servant's child found stealing under your dining table. Surely the matter is for the housekeeper, and surely we may now return to the question of whether the reform petition—" "The boy," said the Duke, in a voice the room had not yet heard from him, "is a guest of this house. He has not eaten. The mutton is admirable. The pears are very fine. Mrs. Linton, the chair, please. Mrs. Whitford, beside him." He did not raise his voice. He had not, in fact, ever needed to. He had learned, at the age of 12, in the long, cold corridor of this house, that a Duke of Wexford could end most arguments by lowering his voice rather than by lifting it. The chair was brought. The setting was laid. The boy was lifted into the seat by Mrs. Linton, whose hands trembled and did not betray her. Mrs. Whitford came forward at last and sat, not beside her son, because that was a place for a guest of higher rank, but on the chair set for her at the lower bend of the table, one place removed, where the children of country gentry sat at a parish dinner. She kept her hand against the locket at her throat. She did not look at the Duke. The Duke asked the boy his name. "Thomas Whitford," said the boy. The Duke gave the name back unaltered, and observed that Thomas had been hiding under his table for some time. Thomas considered this gravely and said, "Since the bell. The first bell, when the carriages had come in. He had heard the gentleman coming. He had not yet had his dinner. The servants' dinner came after the guests, and the saffron rolls had smelt, he said, of the sun. He had thought he would only take one. Then the doors had opened, the kitchen was busy, and so he had gone under the table, because it was the only door that was not watched. The cheese, Thomas explained, looking at it in his hand as if he had forgotten it was there, he had taken from the salver after the gentleman was seated. He had crawled. He was very sorry. He should not have. He had known he should not have. His mother had told him 10 times that the table was not for him when there were great gentlemen. The Duke asked, gently, why he had not gone up to the kitchen and asked Mrs. Linton for a roll. Thomas, 6 years old, looked at him with the small, clear eyes of a child who had learned a rule he was certain a duke would now confirm. Because servants' children are not to ask for food when there are guests in the house, sir, my mother said, and the housekeeper said, and the under-butler said. It is the rule, sir. He paused. I am very sorry I broke it under the table. I will not break it again. In the great south dining room of Wexford Hall, surrounded by 14 peers of the county of York, on the day on which the future of the Yorkshire vote was meant to turn upon the question of the reform petition, the Duke of Wexford pressed his thumb against the signet ring on his left hand, exactly once, and felt, somewhere very low in his chest, in a place he had been told at the age of 6 did not exist, a thing that was neither fury nor pity, but something altogether new, which had decided, in the half-second between the cheese and the rule, to take up residence in his life. Thomas, he said, will you eat your roll now, slowly, with the cheese, and I will eat mine, and then, when we have both finished, we will discuss what is to be done about the rule. Thomas Whitford, 6 years old, looked at the Duke of Wexford. Then he looked at his mother. Then he looked at the roll in his hand. Then, with the great courteous slowness of a small boy who had been waiting since the first bell, he lifted it to his mouth and took a careful bite. The 14 peers of the county of York said nothing at all. Lord Crewes was smiling. Mrs. Linton had set one hand against the door jamb. Mrs. Whitford was not weeping. She had folded her hands together in her lap, very tightly, and she was looking at the spoon beside her son's plate, and the locket at her throat rose and fell with a small, careful rhythm that was not quite breath. Outside, in the long October garden, the last leaves of the limes were turning. A clock in the corner of the dining room counted out 3/4 of the hour, and the Duke of Wexford, who had not been able to forgive his father for 13 years, picked up a saffron roll from his own plate and broke it open, and held one half across the table to a small boy who had not yet learned how to ask. It was a great deal further back than 13 years, of course, that the rule had been laid down. He was 6 himself. He had been a wiry, restless boy with sandy hair and a habit of vanishing from his nursery to the kitchens, because the kitchens were warm, and Mrs. Linton's mother had been the cook in those days, and had let him sit on the table with a mug of milk and a corner of bread. He had loved her with the unstudied seriousness of a small boy who had not been told there were places he was not to love. The kitchen smelt of bread and damp wool drying by the stove. He had liked, very particularly, the way the cook hummed when rolling out pastry, and did not know she was being heard. He had been pulled out of that kitchen by his father on a Wednesday afternoon in late spring. The 7th Duke of Wexford, 6 feet tall and very thin, with a long, pale face and the precise diction of a man who had read Latin to himself for 40 years, had stood in the doorway of the kitchen, and had not entered it. He had only lifted one gloved hand. The cook had set down her rolling pin. Davy, the stable boy, had got up so quickly his stool had fallen. "Adrian," his father had said, "come." He had come. He had thought, with the bright optimism of a 6-year-old, that they were going out to look at the new mayor. He had been led, instead, the long way through the back corridor and up the servants' stair and along the gallery to the library, which was a cold room he did not like, and his father had closed the door behind them and had set him on the leather chair by the empty grate, and had looked down at him for a long moment without speaking. Then his father had said, "A duke's house is for great men, Adrian, not for small ones." He had not understood at first what was meant. He had nodded. He had said, "Yes, sir." His father had said, "You will not go to the kitchen again. You will not sit on the table. You will not take milk from the cook's hand. You are the heir to this house. You belong in the rooms where this house is governed, and not in the rooms where this house is fed." He had not wept. He had been told that morning by his nurse, and twice before by his mother, that the 7th Duke of Wexford did not care for tears in the corridors where the footmen could hear. He had only, after a long pause, asked one question, because he had been a careful child even then. "But, Papa," he had said, "if I do not go to the kitchen, when shall I see Mrs. Linton?" His father had looked at him for a long moment. Then he had said, "You will not see Mrs. Linton. Mrs. Linton is at her work. She does not require your company, and you do not require hers. She is paid to do her work, Adrian. That is not the same thing as love." He had been 6. He had only understood that the warm, low kitchen had been folded up and put away, and that the gallery and the library and the long, cold corridor were now the rooms in which his life would be conducted. He had gone back to the nursery. He had not, after that day, eaten in the kitchen again. He had learned to press his thumb against the signet ring on his left hand when his father said something he was not permitted to answer aloud. The 7th Duke of Wexford was 11 years in the family vault. The kitchen smelt of saffron rolls again on the day 14 peers were to be entertained, because Mrs. Linton, daughter of the cook who had once given Adrian half a roll with butter, had decided, without consulting anyone, that they would. The boy under the table had been pulled out from beneath the polished mahogany at 20 minutes past 1. The library, 4 corridors away, was empty and cold, and had been empty and cold for 11 years. It was the rule that had broken him, not the theft, the rule. He had sat back down at his own table. He had finished his half of the saffron roll. He did not look at his father's portrait above the sideboard. "Thomas," he had said again, after a time, "when you have finished, will you tell me, please, who taught you the rule?" Thomas swallowed his bite with great care. "My mother, sir, and Mrs. Linton, and the under-butler. They all said it." "And before them?" Thomas considered. "I do not know, sir. It is the rule. I think it has always been." "Yes," said the Duke. "I think it has always been. I do not think anyone living in this house remembers when it began. I should like, after our luncheon is finished, to discover where it lives, so that we may decide whether it shall continue." Lord Cruise, who had been turning his glass between his fingers, said into the carefully empty air, "Wexford, a house cannot be governed by sentiment. The rule exists for very good reasons. The servants must have their place. The guests must have theirs. The children of the servants, and I say this kindly, my dear fellow, because you are clearly under some strong feeling at the moment, the children of the servants are not, in any house I have ever entered, expected to sit at the table beside their betters. It is not, I venture, a question of charity. It is a question of order." "Cruise," said the Duke pleasantly, "if I require your view on the order of my own table, I shall ask for it. In the meantime, would you be so good as to pass the salver?" The Marquis of Brentley, who had been the senior peer in the room and the most powerful in Yorkshire, and the man whose vote on the reform petition was the single most important political fact of the autumn, set down his glass with the slow, deliberate care of a man who had decided something. He picked up his spoon and tapped the side of it once against his cup. The room turned to him. "Wexford," he said, "I should like to know what is the matter with this household, that a child has hidden under the table for an hour to eat a single roll. I shall not interrupt your luncheon, but before I take my leave, I shall like to know the answer. And so, I think, shall every man at this table." The Duke inclined his head. "You shall know it, my lord. I shall know it first. Then you shall know it. Cruise, the salver, if you please." Lord Cruise, smiling, passed the salver. He passed it with the particular smiling slowness of a man who had begun, in the half-second between the cheese and the rule, to compose a letter to the court journal in his head. The luncheon continued. Thomas Whitford ate his roll with the cheese. He ate, after that, a slice of pressed mutton, cut very small by his mother, and a pear quartered for him by Mrs. Linton. He drank a quarter cup of small beer mixed with water. He did not, at any point, speak unless spoken to. When he had finished, he laid his hands flat on the cloth on either side of his plate and looked at the Duke with the polite stillness of a guest who had been very well brought up and who had only had to be reminded that morning that he had been very well brought up. Mrs. Whitford did not eat. Her hands were set together in her lap and had not moved. Once, very briefly, she lifted her eyes and met the Duke's across the table. The locket chain at her throat caught the light. The Duke saw that her eyes were the dark green of the river in winter, that she had been very beautiful once, and was still very beautiful, and that she was holding herself, by an effort of will he could feel from his own chair, exactly upright in front of 14 peers of the county of York. After the cloth was removed, and the gentlemen were left with their port, Mrs. Linton had been instructed, very quietly, that there would be no port served in front of the boy, and the gentleman had been moved instead into the small green saloon for it. The Duke walked his guests as far as the gallery door. The Marquis of Brently paused there. He set his hand on the Duke's sleeve for a moment. "Wexford," he said. "My lord?" "I have known your house for 40 years. "Yes, my lord." "I knew your father." "Yes, my lord." "He would not have lifted that cloth." The Duke considered this. He had been told, in one form or another, all his life. "No, my lord, he would not." "You did?" "Yes." The Marquis looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice that was meant to be heard by no one else, and was therefore softer than his usual one, "I have not yet decided how I shall vote, Wexford. But I have decided that I shall listen to you when you write to me about the petition. That is more than I had decided 2 hours ago. Good afternoon to you." Lord Cruise lingered in the doorway. He said, very pleasantly, "Wexford, charming luncheon, memorable even. You will permit me to say, only because we have known each other since Eton, that you have made a mistake today which you will spend the next 6 months unmaking. The county is small. The talk will be quick. A servant's child seated at the Duke's table, and the Duke himself crouching to lift the cloth. It is not the kind of story that quiets itself. I shall do what I can, but I cannot, in conscience, refrain from noting it where it must be noted." The Duke answered that he would write Cruise's kindness in the book. Lord Cruise laughed once, lightly, as if at a witty remark, and went out. The gallery door closed behind him. The corridor was empty. The Duke of Wexford stood for a moment, with one hand against the cold wood. Then he turned, and walked back down the gallery, and went not into the library, but into the morning room, because that was where the small carved oak chair lived, in which a child had eaten a saffron roll, and that was the room in which, by some quiet decision he had not yet allowed himself to name, the rest of the afternoon was now to be conducted. Mrs. Whitford was in the morning room. She was standing by the window seat with her son's hand in hers. She had been about to take him out by the back stair. She turned at the sound of the door, and her face went very still, the way it had gone in the dining room doorway, and her free hand rose to the locket chain at her throat. "Your Grace," she said. "Mrs. Whitford." Your Grace, I shall give you my notice this hour. I shall be out of the house by morning. I shall take Thomas to my sister at Beverley. I shall not impose upon—" "Mrs. Whitford." "Your Grace, please, I beg you, do not require me to—" "Mrs. Whitford, sit down, please." She did not sit. She did, however, stop speaking. Thomas, beside her, looked from one adult to the other with the careful neutrality of a small boy who had learned that adults sometimes negotiated above his head and that it was wiser not to interrupt. The Duke, who had taken the chair across from the window seat and set his hand flat on the carved arm of it, said he did not want her notice. He wanted, if she would permit, her account, beginning with how long she had been in this house. 5 weeks, she answered. 3 years at Knaresborough before that, she added when he asked. And before that? She did not answer at once. Her knuckles on the window frame had gone white. Before that, she said after a moment, she had been the wife of an officer in His Majesty's 23rd Foot. Her husband had fallen at Salamanca. She had been left with her boy and a small pension, which, when exhausted, had become a smaller pension, which had been exhausted in turn. She had taken service at Knaresborough. She had come to Wexford on Mrs. Linton's recommendation, with the housekeeper's word that the boy might be kept quiet and never be a nuisance. She had failed in that. She was very deeply ashamed. She would be gone by morning. He asked her husband's name. She looked at him. The locket chain glinted again. Captain James Whitford, she said. 23rd Foot. He had fallen on the 2nd day at Salamanca, in the action by the lesser Aristocratic. The Duke of Wexford was a man who had been schooled, since the age of 12, in the management of his face. He managed it now. Captain James Whitford of the 23rd Foot, he said quietly, who had carried Lord Henry Sefton off the field of the lesser Aristocratic when Lord Henry's horse had been killed under him. She stared at him. She did not seem to be able to find a word at first. Lord Henry, she repeated. His brother, the Duke confirmed. His brother had written of her husband from Spain, he told her then. The family had the letter still. Captain Whitford had brought Henry in across 200 yards of musket fire, and had then gone back, against the orders of his colonel, for a young ensign of his own company. He had not, the letter said, come back the second time. The letter was in the cabinet behind her. His mother had had it framed in plain oak. His brother had carried it back from Spain himself when he came home invalided in the autumn of that year, and had not, in 11 years, lost it. She had set her hand against the window seat now, and had sat down upon it, not by decision, but because her knees had decided for her. Thomas climbed up beside her at once, and put his small hand against her sleeve, and did not say anything. Outside the window, the long, pale October light fell across the lawn, and a single late thrush sang once, and was silent. I did not know, she said very quietly. He never wrote of it. He wrote that he had carried out an officer. He did not say which one. He was not a man who... No, said the Duke. I imagine he was not. The thanks of the family are owed you, Mrs. Whitford, and have been for 11 years. They have never been paid. They will be paid now. Your Grace, Mrs. Whitford. He leaned forward. He had set both hands now on the arms of the chair. You shall not give me your notice this hour. You shall not take Thomas to your sister at Beverley. You shall, if you will permit me, take this afternoon to rest, and tomorrow morning, after breakfast, you shall come into the morning room and sit with me by this window seat, and we shall discuss, quietly between us, the matter of the rule under which your son did not feel he could ask Mrs. Linton for a role. That rule does not, I think, deserve to live in this house any longer. It will be, by your leave, taken out and shot. She made a small sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob. Thomas, who had been listening with the great attention of a small boy who suspected he had been the subject of a great many sentences he had not entirely followed, lifted his face to his mother's and said, in a clear, small voice, Mamma, has the Duke given me leave to ask for a role now? Thomas Whitford, said his mother, and her voice was nearly steady. The Duke has given you leave to ask for a role now. "Then," said Thomas, with the great considered solemnity of his 6 years, "I should like to thank His Grace. Sir, thank you." The Duke of Wexford bowed his head, gravely, as he had bowed it to dowagers and to bishops and to the Lord Chancellor of England, and said, "Master Whitford, the thanks are mine." He stood. He went to the door of the morning room. He paused there, with his hand on the brass handle, and turned back. "Mrs. Whitford." "Your Grace?" "The locket at your throat. May I ask what is in it?" She lifted one hand to it. Her fingers closed around it once, gently, as if to be sure it was still there. "A lock of my husband's hair, Your Grace, and a small slip of paper on which he wrote my name. Nothing more." "Thank you," said the Duke. "I had wondered. Good afternoon to you both. Until tomorrow." He went out. The morning room door clicked quietly behind him. Mrs. Sarah Whitford sat on the window seat with her son in her lap and looked at the long October light on the lawn and did not weep. Thomas, after a moment, asked her if there was, perhaps, another saffron roll. There was. Mrs. Linton brought one in herself, on a small plate with butter, and said only, in passing, "His Grace has asked me to tell Mrs. Whitford that there is to be tea in the morning room at 4, 2 cups, and milk for the boy." The corridor outside the morning room was empty and very long, and was, for the first time in 11 years, beginning to be warm. The talk was quick, as Lord Crews had said it would be. By morning, the gossip had crossed 3 parishes. By afternoon, a letter had reached the Court Journal in London, and a small, unsigned paragraph appeared the following week under the heading, "A Yorkshire Curiosity." It spoke of a great house in the north, in which the master had recently been seen to seat a servant's child at his own dining table during a luncheon for 14 peers, and remarked that the boy's mother was a young widow of uncommon comeliness, taken into service at Michaelmas. No names were given. None were needed. Every reader in the 3 ridings set down the paper and said, "Wexford." The Duke had expected it. He had passed Lord Crews in the carriage drive on the morning after the luncheon, and Lord Crews had inclined his head with the particular civility of a man who had already written the letter, and the Duke had inclined his head in return. What the Duke had not expected was that his aunt, the Dowager Duchess of Wexford, 73 years old and resident these 11 years in the Dower House at Stamfield, would receive the Court Journal by the same Wednesday post, read it before her tea, order her carriage before her tea was cool, and arrive at the front door of Wexford Hall at 11:30 on the Thursday morning, with her cane already in her hand. She was a small woman. She had the same long, pale face as her late brother, and the same precise diction, and the same habit of pressing her thumb against her own signet ring when she was about to deliver a verdict she had been polishing in private. She was the only living person in the world who could speak to the Duke of Wexford in the tone in which he had been spoken to at the age of 6. She used it now. "Adrian," she said, in the gallery, before she had even untied her bonnet, "I should like to see you in the library, at once, and I should like to see you alone." "Aunt Imogen," said the Duke. "At once, Adrian." He took her into the library. He set her in the great leather chair by the fire, the same chair on which he himself had been set, aged 6, by his father, and he stood by the mantelpiece, and he waited. She did not sit at first. She walked the length of the library twice with her cane held lightly in her hand. She did not look at him. She was choosing her opening, as she had chosen them for 60 years. She had read the paragraph, she told him, before her tea, and had ordered her carriage before the tea was cool. There was no name in it. There did not need to be. Crews had written it, she said, with the precise spite of a small man who had been spoken to without sufficient civility on the Tuesday, and whose vote had not been, in his estimation, sufficiently courted. Crews she had known since he was 8. She had no illusions about him. That, she added, was not the question. He asked what the question was. She turned then, and looked at him for the first time, Her eyes were the very grey eyes his father had had, and said it plainly. The question was whether he had done a great kindness on Tuesday afternoon, or a great folly. And the question after that, which she would not spare him because she was too old and too fond of him to do so, was whether he had begun to do a thing which had not been done in this house since his father was a young man, and which, on the last occasion it had been done, had ended in scandal and in 2 ruined lives. He said it for her very quietly. She meant his Uncle Frederick. She meant Frederick, who in 1791 had taken into his protection a young widow of his late steward, who by 1793 had married her without his father's consent, and who by 1795 was gone in a hunting accident the magistrate of the day had refused to call by its proper name. Frederick, she said, was the reason the late 7th Duke had closed the kitchen door to him when he was 6. His father had not been talking about size. He had been talking about Frederick. The Duke set his hand against the mantelpiece. He had not known this. He had been told since boyhood that his Uncle Frederick had fallen from a horse, and that the matter was not discussed. His father, the Dowager said, had been afraid Adrian would love a cook and marry her, as Frederick had married his widow. He had been a frightened man, dressed in dignity. He had closed every door in this house that he was afraid of, and had taught Adrian to call the closing of them order. He had been wrong. She had known it for 40 years and had not said so. She said it now. But he was not wrong to be afraid, Adrian. There is a difference. The Duke did not speak. He was looking at the small, carved curl at the top of the cane resting against his aunt's chair. Cruz, she went on, was going to make a thing of this. He had already requested an audience with her for Friday afternoon. He would suggest that the Duke had done in 1819 what Frederick had done in 1791, not because he believed it, but because he knew it was the one line that would cut. In the next fortnight, he would oblige them to choose between 2 answers. One would quiet him, the other would not. She had come to ask which of the 2 he meant to give. The Duke was silent for a long time. The fire spoke in the grate. The clock on the mantelpiece, which had been wound by the same butler for 40 years, counted out a small, precise series of seconds. He spoke, at last, of the letter framed in the morning room. It was from his brother Henry, written from a field hospital in Spain in the autumn of Salamanca, and spoke at length of a Captain James Whitford of the 23rd Foot, who in the action by the lesser Arapile had twice ridden out into musket fire, once to carry Henry off the field, and once to bring in a young ensign of his own company, and who had not returned the second time. His mother had framed the letter in plain oak. It had hung in the morning room these 11 years. The woman in service in this house, he told her then, the under-housemaid taken on at Michaelmas, was Captain Whitford's widow. Her son was that captain's son. They were the family of the man who had carried Henry off the field at Salamanca, and who, the second time, had not come back, for a boy of 17. The pension she had been paid had been exhausted these 3 years. She had been in service since. She had not asked anything of this family. She had not known, until the afternoon before, that the officer her husband saved was his brother. The Dowager set her hand flat on the curl of the cane. He had, she said then, in the question of how this was to be answered, 2 duties. One was to the name. The other was to that letter in the morning room. They were not, on this occasion, in conflict. They had only been put in conflict by Cruz, who had no business with either. She set out the practical course in plain order. He would write to her solicitor in Lincoln's Inn before the morning was out, instructing the drafting of an annuity for the widow of Captain James Whitford in such terms as a regimental gratuity ought to have been paid 11 years ago. He would arrange that a small property, the cottage at Ravensgate, be made over to the boy in trust until his majority, and he would draft a public letter to be carried by her hand to the court journal, naming Captain Whitford, naming the action at the lesser Arapile, naming what was owed, and by whom. The paragraph would be answered. It would not be answered with denial. It would be answered with a fact. Cruz could not quarrel with a fact. That, she said, was one of the two answers. Was he going to give her the other? The Duke looked at her. He had pressed his thumb once against the signet ring on his left hand, and then, with deliberation, had not pressed it a second time. Not today, he said. Not until he had spent more than one afternoon in her company. He would not, he thought, learn that lesson again from Cruz. Whatever the second answer was, he would not let Cruz name the date of it. The Dowager Duchess of Wexford looked at her nephew for a long moment. Then she rose from the leather chair by the fire. She tapped her cane once against the parquet. She crossed to him and reached up, for she was a small woman and he was a tall man, and laid the back of her gloved hand for a moment against his cheek. "That," she said, "is a better answer than your father would have given at your age. It is a better answer, in fact, than your father gave at any age. Have my chair brought to the morning room, Adrian. I should like to take tea with Mrs. Whitford and the boy at 4. You will not be present. I shall manage them myself." "Yes, Aunt." "And, Adrian." "Aunt, you will not, on any account, allow yourself to be alone with Mrs. Whitford until I have had my tea. Whatever you think of her, you think it with my permission first. That is not a small instruction. That is the only instruction I shall give you on this matter. Are we understood?" "We are understood, Aunt." "Good. Send for my solicitor. Send for Cruz, for Friday, not Saturday. And ring for tea. I have, on the whole, had a very tiring morning." She went out of the library with her cane tapping precisely on the parquet, and the Duke of Wexford stood for some minutes by the mantelpiece looking into the fire, and he did not, in those minutes, press his thumb against the signet ring on his left hand, even once. The tea was taken at 4 in the morning room. Mrs. Whitford had been advised by Mrs. Linton that the Dowager Duchess did not bite, she only looked as though she did, and that the correct manner of receiving her was to curtsy once, to remain standing until she gave permission to sit, and on no account to call her Your Grace more than 3 times in any single sentence. Thomas had been brushed and his collar straightened, and had been told by his mother that he was not to ask for a saffron roll without being offered one first, and that if the Dowager spoke to him directly, he was to answer her once, clearly, and not again. The Dowager arrived in the morning room at 5 minutes past 4. Her cane preceded her. She inspected the carved oak chair in which Thomas had eaten his roll the day before. She inspected the window seat. She inspected, with a particular small movement of her head, the framed letter in plain oak which had hung on the wall above the writing desk these 11 years. Then she sat down. She poured her own tea, which was a thing she had not allowed any hostess to do for her in 40 years. She said, "Mrs. Whitford, sit down, please. Boy, come here." Thomas came. He stood beside her chair with his small hands folded behind his back, as a 6-year-old subaltern stands before a regimental colonel, and waited. The Dowager asked his name, and he gave it. She asked his father's name, and he gave that too, with the rank and the regiment. She asked where the man had fallen, and Thomas, 6 years old and very steady, said Salamanca, by a hill his mother called the Lesser Arapile, which he had not seen because he had not yet been born. He had been born, he added, in the November after. The Dowager studied him a long moment. She said he had his father's face about the eyes. She asked Mrs. Whitford whether anyone, in 11 years, had told her so. Mrs. Whitford answered very quietly that there had not. The Dowager said there was now. The boy was directed to the window seat. Mrs. Whitford was instructed to sit, to answer the questions, to eat the lemon cake Mrs. Linton had brought, and not to interrupt. The matters, the Dowager said, were the late captain's pension, the cottage at Ravensgate, the schooling of the boy, and the manner in which the Duke was to be permitted to behave for the next 14 days. The tea lasted an hour and a half. Thomas, on the window seat, ate half a piece of lemon cake and watched the rooks circle the elm at the bottom of the long lawn and did not interrupt once. Mrs. Whitford answered the dowager's questions, when they were put to her, with the careful, steady voice of a woman who had been a captain's wife and had not forgotten how to be one. The dowager poured a second cup of tea. The dowager poured a third. The clock counted out the half hour, and then 5, and then past. The light in the morning room went from pale gold to deep gold, to the slow rose of an October dusk. At the end of the hour and a half, the dowager set down her cup. She said, "Mrs. Whitford, I shall be plain. You will not be dismissed. You will not be made a guest. You will be made, by Christmas, the tenant of the cottage at Ravensgate, with an annuity sufficient for yourself and the boy. The arrangement will be public. The county will know within the fortnight. Captain Whitford will be named in the court journal by Monday's post. The boy will go, when he is of age, to my late husband's old school, at the family's expense. Are these arrangements acceptable to you?" Mrs. Whitford had set her hand against the locket at her throat. She began to call the arrangements kindnesses. The dowager corrected her. They were not kindnesses, but payments, 11 years late. The house was not in the habit of being generous. It was in the habit of being honest. The arrangement would begin at Christmas. Until then, Mrs. Whitford would remain in her present capacity, with the single difference that she would dine in the housekeeper's room, and her son would take his meals with her. She was not, at any time, to sit at the Duke's table without the dowager's prior knowledge. There was one further matter, the dowager added, and it was the Duke himself. He was 28, she said, and had not in his life looked at a woman for longer than 3 minutes. She had measured. He had looked at Mrs. Whitford the previous afternoon for the better part of half an hour. She did not yet know what to do with that fact. She would know within the fortnight. Until she knew, Mrs. Whitford was not on any account to allow herself to be alone with him. If he sought a private interview, she was to direct him to the housekeeper's parlour, where the dowager would be. Mrs. Whitford had gone the colour of paper held too close to a fire. She began to say she had given the Duke no reason. The dowager cut her off. She had not. He had given the dowager reason, on his own account, without her participation, and what reason it was, the two of them would work out between them. Mrs. Whitford would not be required to manage him. The dowager would manage him, that being the one thing she was, in fact, good at. The cake, the dowager declared, had been admirable. Then she called the boy. Thomas came. The dowager looked down at him. She set one gloved hand for a moment on the top of his fair head. "You will, in time," she said, "learn that there was a man called your father, and you will learn what he did at Salamanca. And you will, I think, be very proud of him. In the meantime, you will be 6. You will eat your saffron rolls in the kitchen when you wish. You will not hide under tables. If you are hungry, you will ask. The rule is changed. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Grace," said Thomas. "Good. Mrs. Whitford, good afternoon." The dowager went out. Her cane tapped down the gallery. The carriage rolled out of the drive at 5 o'clock precisely. The morning room was very quiet. Mrs. Whitford sat for a long time on the window seat with her son in her lap and looked at the framed letter in plain oak on the wall above the writing desk. And after a great while she got up, very steadily, and crossed to it, and read it for the first time since she had come to the house. She did not weep. She had not wept in 11 years, and she was not going to begin now. But she stood for a long time with her hand against the plain oak frame, and Thomas, who had climbed down from the window seat and was standing at her elbow, looked up at her after a time and said, quite seriously, "Mamma, is that Papa's name on the paper?" "Yes, Thomas." "Did Papa do a brave thing?" "Yes, Thomas. Papa did a very brave thing." "For the Duke's brother?" "For the Duke's brother." "Then," said Thomas, with the considered solemnity of his 6 years. "I am very glad we came to this house." Mrs. Whitford set her hand against the locket chain at her throat. The locket rose and fell once, with a small, careful rhythm, but was not quite breath. "Yes," she said. "I am very glad we came to this house." In the long gallery outside the morning room, the Duke of Wexford had been standing for some minutes without entering, because he had heard the Dowager's cane go and the morning room door not quite close behind her, and because he had been told by his aunt that he was not to be alone with Mrs. Whitford until she had taken her tea. The tea was now drunk. The Dowager was gone. He could, by the strict letter of the instruction, enter. He did not. He stood at the long window at the gallery's end and watched the carriage roll down the drive between the limes. He had been told today, by his aunt, that his father had closed the kitchen door because of Frederick. He had been told that Frederick was the shape of his father's fear. He had been told that the 7th Duke had not known any coat to put on except dignity. He had been told all his life that dignity was the duty of his house. He stood now at the long window and watched the late October light fall across the lawn, and he thought, with a clarity he had not felt in 11 years, that dignity, which was nothing but fear in a borrowed coat, was not, in fact, dignity at all. He turned. He did not enter the morning room. He went instead the long way down the back corridor and up the servants' stair, the way he had been led by his father on a Wednesday afternoon when he was 6. And at the top of the stair, he turned the wrong way, and at the end of the wrong corridor, he opened a door he had not opened in 22 years. It was the kitchen. Mrs. Linton was standing at the deal table with her sleeves rolled up to the elbows, kneading dough on a flowered cloth, exactly as her mother had once stood and kneaded, with a small boy sitting on the corner of the table, swinging his legs. She looked up. She did not start. She said only, with the long calm of a woman who had served 3 dukes, "Your Grace." "Mrs. Linton." "Will you have a stool, Your Grace?" "I shall, if you can spare one." She fetched a stool from beside the great range and set it by the corner of the deal table. He sat, first as he had sat at 6, with his back very straight and his feet off the ground, and after a moment as a man of 28, with his elbows on the table and his hands folded. Mrs. Linton went on kneading. The kitchen smelt of bread rising and saffron under the cloth on the proving pans. A scullery maid in the corner peeled pears and pretended not to be there. "Mrs. Linton," said the Duke after a time, "your mother used to give me half a roll with butter." "Yes, Your Grace, I remember." His father, he said quietly, had stopped him coming to the kitchen when he was 6. Mrs. Linton answered that she remembered that also. He asked then, with the small, careful diffidence of a boy returning after a long banishment, whether he might have half a roll with butter, if it were not too great an imposition. Mrs. Linton, who had served 3 dukes in this house, and who had not, in any year of her service, been seen by any member of the family to weep, told him very plainly that there was no imposition, and that she would be most particularly glad. She wiped her hands, lifted the cover from the proving pan, tore a saffron roll in half, set it on the plain blue plate with a curl of butter, and set the plate down on the corner of the deal table, on the same square inch of pine on which her mother had set the same plate 22 years ago. She stood opposite, with her hands folded into her apron. "It is a good batch, Your Grace." He ate it slowly. He ate it as Thomas had eaten his, carefully, gravely, without speaking. When he had finished, he set down the plate and told Mrs. Linton the rules were changed. The rule that servants' children were not to ask for food when there were guests. The rule that the master did not enter the kitchen. All of them. He would expect to find Thomas in this kitchen at any hour he liked, eating any roll he liked, addressed by the staff as he and Henry had been addressed in the years when Mrs. Linton's mother had kept the kitchen. Mrs. Linton said only that they were understood. It was, he added then, a very good batch. Mrs. Linton answered, with the small, dry pride of 40 years at a deal table, that she knew. He stood. He laid the plate gently on the deal table. He went down the back corridor and up the gallery into his own library, and he wrote, by his own hand, before the gong went for dinner, a letter to the family solicitor in Lincoln's Inn, instructing the drafting of an annuity for Mrs. Sarah Whitford, and a deed of trust for the cottage at Ravensgate. He also wrote a letter to the court journal, naming Captain Whitford, naming the action at the Lesser Arapile, naming what was owed. He sealed it with the signet ring against the warm wax. He sent it down to the post by the under-butler before the gong rang for the soup. He did not, that evening, go into the morning room. He had been instructed by his aunt not to. He kept the instruction. But before he went up to bed, he wrote one further line on a sheet of his own paper, and he folded it small, and he gave it to Mrs. Linton, who knew where it was to go. It said only, Mrs. Whitford, I am very glad you came to this house. W. Mrs. Linton delivered it at 10:30 that night, to the small, clean room at the top of the back stair, where Mrs. Whitford slept in a narrow bed, and Thomas slept on a truckle beside her. Mrs. Whitford read it by the candle. She did not weep. She folded the paper very small, and put it into the locket at her throat, beside the lock of her husband's hair, and the slip of paper with her name in his writing. And she closed the locket, pressed it once against her collar, and stood for some time at the window, looking out across the long lawn to the limes. In London, on Friday morning, Lord Crewe opened the court journal, and read the paragraph the Duke of Wexford had sent down by the under-butler the previous evening. He read it twice. He set the paper down. He smiled, the long, thin smile, of a man who had been outmaneuvered by a fact, and who had decided to maneuver by a different route. He rang for his man. He ordered the carriage for 2. He wrote 3 letters before breakfast, to a magistrate in York, to a clergyman in Hull, and to an editor in London, whose discretion was more reliable than his integrity. He drank his coffee. He went out. The county would, he had decided, hear a different story by Sunday. By the Saturday morning, however, a different story had begun to settle in Wexford Hall itself, which Lord Crewe had not yet heard, and which was not, in fact, the kind of story that travelled by post. It had begun on the Friday at 10, when the Duke had come out into the back garden with a book under his arm, and had found Thomas Whitford sitting cross-legged on the stone bench by the espaliered pears, trying to read a small, battered Spanish primer Mrs. Whitford had carried in her box from her late husband's effects. Thomas had been turning the pages with the careful concentration of a small boy who had been told the book had been his father's. He had looked up at the Duke, and had stood, because he had been taught to stand, and he had set the book very precisely on the bench beside him. "Sit down, Thomas," the Duke had said. "We are out of doors. The rules of the gallery do not apply to the espaliered pears." Thomas had sat. He had folded his small hands in his lap. He had looked at the book, and then at the Duke, and then back at the book. It was, Thomas explained, his father's Spanish primer. He did not yet read Spanish, but he knew 3 words: sí for yes, no for no, pan for bread, and his mother knew a little more. The Duke asked to be taught the 3, and Thomas, after a moment's careful consideration of whether the Duke was making a joke, taught them gravely, one by one. The Duke repeated each word with the seriousness of a man memorizing a treaty. When the Duke asked how one said "thank you" in Spanish, for Thomas's father would have known, the boy could not say. He would ask his mother. Then they would ask her together, said the Duke, at the proper time. He had sat on the stone bench beside the boy, in the long, pale October light, and the 2 of them had gone through the primer at the speed of the slowest reader. Mrs. Whitford had come out at 11 with a basket of mending, and had seen them there, and had stopped at the corner of the path with her hand against her apron. She stood quite still for a long moment before moving on. The Duke had not seen her. Thomas had. He only mentioned it once she had gone in, leaning a fraction closer to the Duke's elbow. That Mamma had seen, and that, by the long, careful judgment of a 6-year-old who had learned to read his mother's silences, she had not minded. The Duke of Wexford set his hand for a moment on the small, fair head of the boy beside him, and thanked him for the great help he had been. By the Saturday morning, the routine had set. Thomas had taken his bread in the kitchen at 7. Mrs. Whitford had carried up the brasses by the kitchen door at 8. The Duke had come down to the morning room at 9 with a small stack of Henry's letters from Spain, which he meant to open in Mrs. Whitford's company. The Dowager had sent word she would call at tea-time. The under-butler had been instructed that the children of the servants were to be addressed by their Christian names, and that any child of any servant was, at any hour, to be permitted a roll from the proving pan upon asking. Mrs. Whitford came into the morning room at 9:10. She had Thomas by the hand. She had set her hand at the locket at her throat, as she had done at the dining-room doorway, but she had not, on this morning, looked at the floor. She had looked, for one long, careful second, at the Duke. Then she had curtsied. Then she had sat, when he had set out the chair for her, in the carved oak chair by the window seat. Thomas had climbed up on the window seat beside her without being asked, and had folded his small hands in his lap, and had watched the rooks circling the elm at the bottom of the lawn. "Mrs. Whitford," said the Duke. "Your Grace. I have a number of my brother's letters here. They are from Spain, from the year of Salamanca and the year after. They mention Captain Whitford by name in 7 of them, I have counted. I have not read them in 11 years. I thought that perhaps we might read them together, if it does not pain you too greatly." She did not answer at once. Her hand had risen to the locket chain and had closed around it. She said, "Your Grace, it will pain me, but I should be very greatly obliged to read them. I have not heard my husband's name spoken aloud in this room, or in any room since I came north. I should like, if I may, Thomas to hear it." "Then he shall." He had read them aloud. The first, from the 3rd of August in the year of Salamanca, spoke of the heat and the dust and the men of the company, and at the end Henry had written, "We have a Captain Whitford in the 23rd Foot, who is, by general agreement, the finest officer of his line. He has been kind to me, as a younger brother would have been, and asks always after Adrian, of whose existence I have foolishly informed him at some length." Mrs. Whitford had set her hand on Thomas's small knee. Thomas had not moved. The Duke had read on. They had read 3 more after tea. In the 5th, written in the November after the Lesser Arapile, Henry had described being invalided home with a packet to be given by his own hand to Mrs. James Whitford. Such effects of the late captain as the regiment had gathered, including the small Spanish primer the captain had been particularly fond of. It had been intended, Henry wrote, for the boy whom the captain spoke of throughout the night before the action, whom he had never seen, and whom he had hoped to see in the spring of next year if the regiment were brought home. Thomas had set his hand on the page over the word boy very carefully, without speaking, and had not lifted it for some time. The Duke had folded the letter. He had set it down. He had looked across the carved oak table at Mrs. Whitford and had said, in a voice that was not, for him, entirely steady, "I did not know my brother had carried the primer himself. I have it now. I have had it now for 6 days." "You did not know, Your Grace, that it was in the box of effects?" "My mother kept the box closed. She gave it to me with the rest of her papers when she died, 4 years ago. I had not opened it. I opened it this morning, before I came down. The primer is upstairs in my study. Thomas, when we have finished reading my brother's letters, I think we shall go and fetch it. The one you have been carrying has lost the binding. The one upstairs has been kept in tissue. It is the same primer. Your father gave each of you a copy, in a sense. You have been reading the one he carried with him every day. The one upstairs is the one he set aside for you." Thomas had looked up at his mother. He had said, in a very small voice that did not break because he had been taught not to let it break, "Mama?" "Yes, Thomas?" "There are 2 books. Yes, Thomas. One for me and one Papa kept. Yes, Thomas. Mama? Yes, Thomas. Thomas had set both small hands flat against the carved oak table and had bowed his head a moment in the small, grave fashion of a 6-year-old soldier at a regimental funeral. Then he had looked up. He had said, Mama, I should like to read both books one day. With you. You shall, Thomas. And, sir, Your Grace, when I read the second book, will you read it with us? The Duke of Wexford, who had been told at the age of 6 that a duke's house was for great men and not for small ones, said simply, I will read it with you both, Thomas. Every page, in any order, in any room of this house. Yes. After the reading, after Mrs. Linton's tea, after Thomas had gone away with Mrs. Linton to the kitchen to ask, on his own account and for the first time in his life, for a saffron roll, without being prompted. The Duke and Mrs. Whitford had remained in the morning room. Mrs. Whitford had been folding the small stack of red letters back into their ribbon. The Duke had been standing at the window, looking out across the long lawn. Neither had spoken for some minutes. He had said, at last, without turning, Mrs. Whitford. Your Grace. I have not, in 11 years, opened my brother's box of letters, because I had been told, at the age of 6, that my father did not weep in the corridors where the footman could hear. I had carried that instruction further than my father had intended. I had not understood, until this week, how much further. I should like to thank you, very plainly, for being in this room while I opened it. I do not think I could have opened it alone. She had not answered for a moment. Then she had said, in the same careful, steady voice she had used to the Dowager, Your Grace, it was no kindness of mine. I have not opened my husband's letters in 11 years either. I have read them this week because you were in the room. You should not, please, thank me for it. We have, I think, been of some small use to each other this morning. He had turned then. He had looked at her across the morning room, the river-green eyes, the dark plum gown that he had not, in the carriage drive, ever quite been able to stop noticing, the small, precise rise and fall of the locket chain. And he had said, Mrs. Whitford. Your Grace? I am, by my aunt's instruction, not to be alone with you. The instruction was given on Thursday afternoon. It is now Saturday morning. I have already been alone with you for 40 minutes. I shall, by way of obedience to my aunt, ring for Mrs. Linton. But before I ring, and only if it does not offend, I should like to say one thing that is not, I think, fit for Mrs. Linton's hearing. Your Grace, I have looked at you, Mrs. Whitford, every day for 5 weeks without knowing your name. I have looked at you for 3 days now, knowing it. I have not, in 28 years, looked at any woman in the way I am, at this moment, unable to refrain from looking at you. I shall not oblige you to manage that statement. My aunt has reserved the management of it to herself. I say it now only so that you do not hear it from Crews first, or from Sunday's Court Journal. You will hear it now, from me, in this room. That is all. I shall ring for Mrs. Linton. She had stood very still. She had not, this time, gone the colour of paper held too close to a fire. She had gone, instead, a colour that you had not before seen on her. A colour very close to the warmth of saffron, under a cloth at the moment before it goes into the oven. She had set her hand on the back of the carved oak chair as if to steady herself, and had said, in a voice that was not, for her, entirely her own, Your Grace, I have heard you. I shall hear your aunt also. That is all I can, in honour, say at this moment. Please ring for Mrs. Linton. He had rung. Mrs. Linton had come in within half a minute, as if she had not been entirely on the other side of the morning room door. The conversation had gone on, for the Dowager's benefit, on the subject of the annuity and the cottage at Ravensgate, and the schooling that would be appropriate for a 6-year-old who had 3 Spanish words and a battered primer to his name. Mrs. Linton had stood by the writing desk and had pretended, with very great civility, that the conversation she was overhearing was entirely the one being conducted. At the end of it, Mrs. Whitford had risen, had curtsied, had laid one hand for a moment on the framed letter in plain oak above the writing desk, as a person might lay a hand on a stone at a parish boundary, and had gone out. Mrs. Linton had remained. She had looked at the Duke for a long, careful moment over her folded apron. "Your Grace." "Mrs. Linton." "Your aunt has instructed me to be standing exactly where I am at exactly the moment at which you rang." "Yes." "I have, Your Grace, in my fashion, also reserved an opinion on this matter." "You have?" "I have, Your Grace. I shall not share it. I shall only say that I knew your father, your mother, and your Uncle Frederick. I had an opinion on each of them. It is the privilege of housekeepers to have such opinions and not to say them. I shall keep this one also. I shall say only that I have not, in 3 dukes of this house, seen one of them stand at the morning-room window with that particular slope to the shoulders. It is a slope I had thought I might not live long enough to see. Will that be all, Your Grace?" "Mrs. Linton." "Your Grace." "You make me, sometimes, very glad your mother was the cook in this house." "I am very glad, Your Grace, that my mother was the cook in this house also. Will that be all?" "That will be all, Mrs. Linton." She had gone. The morning-room was very quiet. The Duke had stood for some minutes more by the long window, looking at the limes on the lawn, and pressing his thumb gently against the signet ring on his left hand exactly once. Not in apprehension this time, but in the slow, steady way of a man taking a measurement. The Sunday morning brought, with the first post, the 2nd paragraph in the court journal. It had not, this time, been written by the Duke. It had been written by an editor in London, on the strength of the 3 letters Lord Crewe had sent on the Friday. The paragraph was longer than the first. It named no names. It spoke, with the polished neutrality of fine linen, of a certain great house in the north. The same house, the paragraph noted, which last week was the subject of a curiosity concerning a child found under the table, in which a great deal of unsuitable feeling appeared, it was reported, to be passing between the master of the house and a young widow in service. The paragraph did not, as the first had done, raise the question gently. It raised it sharply. It noted the precedent of an earlier scandal in the same family 3 decades ago. It noted, with great civility, that the Dowager Duchess had been seen to take tea with the widow on the Thursday, which, the editor felt able to remark, could only be interpreted as the family's acknowledgement that the matter had advanced beyond what could be ignored. The Duke read it before breakfast. He folded the paper. He set it down on the breakfast tray with the precise, quiet care of a man arranging a piece of evidence. He did not, for a moment, speak. The under-butler, Mr. Brent, had brought up the paper. He stood by the door. "Mr. Brent." "Your Grace." "Mrs. Whitford has seen this." "She has not, Your Grace. The kitchen does not see the court journal before the morning-room has done with it." "Good. The kitchen will not see this number, Mr. Brent. Burn it." "Yes, Your Grace." "And, Mr. Brent." "Your Grace." "Tell Mrs. Linton, please, that there is to be an additional precaution today. Mrs. Whitford and Thomas are not, at any time during the day, to leave this house unaccompanied. Not into the village, not to the church, not into the gardens beyond the kitchen wall. Mrs. Linton is to find some reason that does not alarm them. I do not want them to know, yet, what has been written." "Yes, Your Grace." "Send to the Dowager at Stamfield. Ask her to come, please, before luncheon." "Yes, Your Grace." The Dowager arrived at 20 minutes past 11. She had already read the paragraph. She had brought her cane and her solicitor's clerk and an air which the gallery had not seen on her in 7 years. She did not, this time, go into the library. She went straight into the small green saloon, closed the door behind her, and set her cane against the writing desk. Cruz, she said in one word, had gone further than she had supposed he would. She had expected the second paragraph. She had not expected the line about Frederick. The county would read it before nightfall, the clergy on Monday, the magistrate at York on Tuesday. They had at most 3 days before Mrs. Whitford heard of it through some chambermaid's kindness or a passing village child. She would, when she heard, do precisely what she had done in the morning room on the Tuesday afternoon: offer her notice, take the boy, and go. They had, between them, this morning, to decide what was to be done before she heard. The Duke replied that he had already given orders she was not to leave the house unaccompanied today. That, the Dowager said, gave them until tomorrow morning. She sat then on the small green sofa, her hands folded on the curl of her cane, and looked at her nephew across the saloon. She had asked him, on Thursday afternoon, whether he was going to give her the other answer. He had said he would not give it that day. It was now the Sunday. Was he going to give it her now? He did not, this time, hesitate. Yes, Aunt. Then give it. I mean to marry her. The Dowager was silent for a long moment. The fire spoke in the grate. The small green saloon held its breath. Then she said, very quietly, Adrian, you have known her 3 days. I have looked at her, Aunt, for 5 weeks. I have known her 3 days. I have read my brother's letters in her company for 2 hours. I have watched her sit on a window seat beside her son, and lay one hand on the page of a Spanish primer over the word that named him. I have looked into a face which has not wept in 11 years, and which is not, in fact, going to weep, and has not asked anything of this family. I have asked of myself, in the 4 days since the luncheon, whether the feeling that came down in me between the cheese and the rule was the feeling my father feared, or whether it was the feeling my Uncle Frederick had been seized by, or whether it was something altogether other than either. And I have decided that it is something altogether other than either. I shall marry her, Aunt, if she will have me, and I shall do it before Christmas, and I shall do it in the parish church of Wexford-le-Moors, and I shall do it with your blessing if you will give it me, or without it if you will not. I tell you so plainly because I love you, and because I do not, in this house, intend to keep secrets from you of any kind. The Dowager looked at him. She set one gloved hand for a moment to her own throat, in the place where, on a thinner, younger neck, the high collar of a 1791 gown had once fastened with a small carved button. She said, after a long moment, Adrian. Aunt, you have your father's voice. Have I? You have it now. You have not, before today, ever used it in this room. He used it twice. Once when he asked your mother to marry him in the long gallery on the morning of the day before he proposed to her formally in the library. Once when he refused, in 1795, to let your Uncle Frederick's widow be cast out of the cottage at Ravensgate, after the magistrate had declined to call the fall by its proper name. He kept her in the cottage for the rest of her life. He sent her son to Eton at his own expense. He never spoke of either action. He did not allow the family to speak of it. He left, in the great closing of the kitchen and the library doors, a quietness in this house, which was not the dignity it pretended to be, but was, as I told you on Thursday, a frightened man's coat. You have, today, taken the coat off. You have done it, Adrian, in a way of which your father would, I think, have been very privately proud, although he would never have said so to your face. You have my blessing. You have my blessing without reservation. You shall not, on this occasion, do without it. Now. Aunt, there is the small matter of the lady. We do not yet know whether the lady will have you. No, Aunt, we do not. The conditions she set were 3. He was not to ask Mrs. Whitford until she had given him leave. He was not to be alone with her again until she had given him leave. And he was, before Tuesday, to draft a letter for London, naming Crews, naming the action at the Lesser Arapio, naming the cottage at Ravensgate and the trust attaching to it, and closing with the announcement of an engagement, provisional upon the lady's consent, between the Duke of Wexford and Mrs. Sarah Whitford. The lady would be told of the letter only after she had been asked, and only after the asking had gone well. He gave his assent to each condition in turn. There was, the Dowager added, one further matter. He would find Mrs. Whitford on the back staircase. She had carried a basket of brasses past the door 3 minutes ago, and had not gone past the saloon since. She had, and it was the single thing the Dowager could not prevent, overheard more of the conversation than was helpful. He was to go out and tell her that whatever she had overheard with the Dowager's permission, that the Dowager would see her in the small green saloon at 3, and that she was not to leave this house tonight, for any reason. Out he went. He went out. The Dowager sat on the small green sofa with her hands folded on the curl of her cane, and looked into the fire, and smiled the very small smile of a woman who had not, in 73 years, been outmaneuvered by a Lord Crews, and who was not now going to be. He found Mrs. Whitford in the corridor outside the saloon. She had set the basket of brasses on the small table by the wall, and was standing very still, with one hand against the doorframe of the linen cupboard. Her face had gone the colour of paper held too close to a fire. Her free hand had closed around the locket chain at her throat. She did not turn at the sound of the saloon door. She did not move. He spoke her name. She began to say she had not meant to overhear. He stopped her gently. He knew. He came to her then, not touching her, standing at a polite 3 feet, the distance the corridor allowed, and set his hand for a moment on the small carved knob of the linen cupboard beside her, as if to take a measurement of the wood. His aunt, he told her, had reserved the management of all this to herself. She would see Mrs. Whitford at 3 in the small green saloon. He had been instructed, and would now obey, to put his hand for a moment on her sleeve and tell her she was not to leave this house tonight, nor any night, for any reason. He would then oblige his aunt by not speaking another word until 3, at which point he would be downstairs waiting for whatever sentence she and the Dowager had decided between them he was to receive. That, he said, was his entire share in this conversation. He set his hand, with great gentleness, on her sleeve. The dark plum wool was thin under his fingers. He could feel the warmth of her arm through it. "Not tonight," he repeated, low and steady. "Not any night, for any reason." He took his hand away. He did not look at her face. He bowed, very precisely, the bow he had given to her son in the morning room when Thomas had thanked him. He went down the gallery. He did not look back. Mrs. Whitford stood for a long time with her hand on the linen cupboard, and the locket chain at her throat rose and fell with a small, careful rhythm that was not quite breath. And after a great while, she picked up her basket of brasses and went down to the kitchen, because the brasses, by the standing rules of the house, were waited for. At 3 o'clock, in the small green saloon, the Dowager Duchess of Wexford spoke to Mrs. Sarah Whitford for 37 minutes by the clock. The Duke was not present. Mrs. Linton was not present. The solicitor's clerk was not present. The conversation was not, in any account known to this house, ever afterwards repeated by either party. What is known is this. Mrs. Whitford came out of the saloon at 23 minutes to 4. Her eyes were red, but not weeping. Her hand was at the locket at her throat. She walked, not quickly, to the morning room, sat at the carved oak table, and sat in great quietness for the better part of half an hour. At 4, the Duke came in. He did not sit. He said simply, "Mrs. Whitford, I have been instructed by my aunt to put one question to you, in her presence, on Tuesday at this hour. Before Tuesday, I am to leave you alone with this room and with this letter." He laid a letter on the carved oak table between them. It was sealed with his own seal. It was addressed to her. "It is not the question," he said. "The question will be put on Tuesday. This is a letter I have written, by hand, at 3 o'clock this afternoon in my own study, for you only. You will read it now, or this evening, or in the morning, or on Tuesday morning, as you prefer. You will not be required to answer it. The question will come from my mouth on Tuesday. Until then, I shall not speak of any of this again. Good afternoon, Mrs. Whitford." He went out. The morning room was very quiet. Mrs. Whitford did not move for some minutes. Then she lifted the letter. She turned it over in her hands. The seal, the Wexford seal, the lion couchant under a coronet, caught the late afternoon light. She broke it, very carefully, with her thumbnail. She read the letter. She read it 3 times. The third time, with her hand against the locket chain at her throat, she set it down on the carved oak table, and stood up, and walked once round the morning room, and stopped at the framed letter in plain oak above the writing desk, and stood looking at her late husband's name in her late brother-in-law by Salamanca's handwriting. And after a long time she said aloud, in the very quiet voice of a captain's wife who had decided something, "Yes, James, I think we shall." She folded the Duke's letter very small. She put it into the locket at her throat, beside the lock of her husband's hair, and the slip of paper with her name in his writing, and the small folded note that Mrs. Linton had brought up by candle on the Thursday evening. The locket would not quite close. She held it shut with her thumb. She went out to fetch her son from the kitchen. The Tuesday did not, however, arrive in the manner the Dowager had planned for it. On the Monday morning, at 9:10, a magistrate of the East Riding called at the front door of Wexford Hall, with Lord Crews in his carriage and a clerk in attendance, and asked to speak with the master of the house upon a small matter of inquiry. The Duke was at his desk, writing in his own hand the 3rd draft of the letter the Dowager had instructed him to produce on the Sunday. He came out at once. Lord Crews did not, on this occasion, smile. He inclined his head with the civility of a man who had decided that smiling was a luxury for those who had not yet been outmanoeuvred by a letter to the court journal. The magistrate was a Mr. Pellet, a thin, elderly gentleman whom the Duke had known since boyhood and who had been godfather to Henry. He stood on the carriage drive with his hat in his hand and explained that Lord Crews had laid a complaint that morning concerning a boy of 6 named Thomas Whitford, asserting the child was being kept in conditions Crews called morally injurious, and requesting that the boy be removed to the workhouse at Beverley, pending an inquiry. Mr. Pellet added that he had come in person to discharge the duty Crews had pressed on him, and to ensure no one was treated with less consideration than the matter demanded. The Duke of Wexford was, by long training, a man who did not raise his voice. He did not raise it now. He said only, "Mr. Pellet, I am very glad you have come yourself. When you step in, bring the clerk. Crews, you will, on this occasion, wait in the carriage. You have made the complaint. The magistrate will hear my answer. You will not. Wexford, you will wait in the carriage, Crews, or I shall send my footman out with instructions which neither of us would, I think, afterwards remember with pleasure. I shall send word when Mr. Pellet has heard me. In the meantime, you may exercise the horses up and down the drive at such pace as does not, in my groom's judgment, injure them. The horses are not, you may be relieved to learn, a subject on which I shall require you to consult either me or the magistrate or the parish overseer. They are entirely your own." Lord Crews opened his mouth. He closed it. He sat down in the carriage. The footman had, in fact, come out by the time he sat down. The door of the carriage was shut behind him with great civility by Mr. Brent, the under-butler, in whose face there was, just visibly, the particular composure of a man who had been hoping for the door to be shut for a very long time. The Duke took Mr. Pellet and his clerk into the library. He set Mr. Pellet by the fire. He stood. He spoke for 26 minutes by the clock. He named Captain James Whitford of the 23rd Foot. He named the action at the Lesser Arapiel. He named his brother Henry, whose horse had been killed under him, and whom Captain Whitford had carried out under musket fire. He named the second sortie, and the young ensign, and the captain not returning. He named the framed letter in plain oak above the writing desk in the morning room, which Mr. Pellet was welcome, in the next hour, to walk through and read. He named the annuity the family solicitor was now drafting, and the cottage at Ravensgate, and the schooling, and the court journal paragraph he had himself written on the previous Thursday. He named, at the end of it, the engagement, provisional upon the lady's consent, to be put to her in the small green saloon at 4 the following afternoon in the Dowager's presence, between himself and Mrs. Sarah Whitford. He laid the third draft of the letter for the court journal on the side table. He laid the solicitor's covering note beside it. He stepped back. Mr. Pellet read the documents in silence. He looked at the framed letter in plain oak. He said, quietly, that he had known the Wexford house since he was 8, and that no part of Cruise's complaint would survive the smallest inquiry in the light of those papers. He undertook to file a brief report stating the complaint had been found without foundation, to name Captain Whitford and the action at the Lesser Arapiel, and to write privately to the Bishop of York before dinner, so that when the inevitable clergyman's letter arrived, the bishop would have a magistrate's note to place beside it. The Duke thanked him plainly. Mr. Pellet, before he rose, asked one further question, gently, as an old friend may. The lady, he observed, had not yet been asked. Was the Duke entirely certain that he wished to ask her? He had, by Mr. Pellet's count, known her 6 days. The Duke said only that he was certain, and that the 6 days were not, on this occasion, the relevant measurement. Mr. Pellet smiled, very slightly, for the first time that morning. He remarked that the Duke's brother Henry had once told him that he had asked his Eleanor inside a fortnight, and had known the answer inside a week, which Mr. Pellet had at the time judged a young man's flippancy, and had since revised. He instructed the Duke to put the question on Tuesday at 4, with his blessing, and to expect him at the wedding breakfast. Then he went out to see Cruise off the premises himself. Lord Cruise was, indeed, seen out, by Mr. Pellet himself, in the carriage drive, in a brief private conversation which lasted 3 minutes, and at the end of which Lord Cruise did not, by general report, sit upright in his carriage as it rolled down the avenue. He did not call again at Wexford Hall. He did not write a third letter to the court journal. He did not, that autumn, attend the Yorkshire vote on the reform petition, having been called away, it was reported, on a small matter of family business in Northumberland. The county, which had a long memory, drew its own conclusions. The Dowager arrived at 2:30. She heard the morning's account. Then she said, "Adrian, we shall advance the schedule by 1 day. The question will be asked at 4 this afternoon, and not on Tuesday. The matter is now in the court journal. The matter is now in the magistrate's bag. The matter is now in the bishop's post. The lady will be asked before sundown, but not before I have told her, in my own voice, exactly what she has been spared this morning. She will not be left in this house another night without knowing whether she stays as my niece or leaves as Mrs. Whitford. Ring for her, Adrian. The small green saloon. At 4. It was 4 when she came in. She had been told only that the Dowager wished her in the small green saloon at 4, and that the Duke would be present. She came in with her hair very neat, her dark plum gown brushed, her white apron taken off, and the locket at her throat closed at last around the small folded papers that had not, the day before, allowed it to. Thomas was in the kitchen with Mrs. Linton, eating his 4th saffron roll of the afternoon and asking, with the full freedom of a 6-year-old to whom the rule had been changed, for a 5th. Mrs. Whitford curtsied at the doorway. She did not, this time, look at the floor. She looked at the Dowager. The Dowager nodded, very slightly. Mrs. Whitford came in and sat in the small carved chair the Dowager indicated. The Duke stood by the writing desk. He pressed his thumb exactly once against the signet ring on his left hand, and then, with deliberation, set both hands flat against the wood, and did not press it again. The dowager began plainly. She would be brief. The magistrate had called that morning. The matter was closed. The Bishop of York would know by Wednesday's post that there was no matter. Lord Crewe was, as of 1 o'clock, no longer a person whose opinion either this house or this county would be required to consult. She would give Mrs. Whitford the full account that evening. None of it, however, was the business for which she had been asked here. The business was the Duke's. He had leave to put a question. She would sit in the corner. She would not interrupt. If an interval were required, Mrs. Whitford had only to ask. Was she ready? Yes, Your Grace. Adrian. The Duke crossed the small green saloon. He did not, in fact, kneel. That was the action of a hero in a popular print, and not of a duke who had been taught at 12 that the body of a duke does not bend except in the saddle. And Mrs. Whitford would not, he had decided some hours ago, want to be asked that way. He drew the small carved chair opposite hers 6 inches closer. He sat. He took, very carefully, her right hand in both of his. Mrs. Whitford. Your Grace. Sarah. Sir. It was the first time she had heard her Christian name from him. It was the first time, also, he had heard the word sir from her, in a register that did not, in fact, sound like a curtsy. The locket chain at her throat caught the late afternoon light. He looked at the river-green eyes, which had not wept in 11 years, and he said, very simply, Sarah, I am the Duke of Wexford. I am 28 years old. I have been told, since I was 6, that the house I keep is for great men, and not for small ones. I have learned, this week, that I was told this in error. I have been a small man for 22 years. She did not interrupt. She did not move. The fire spoke once in the grate. I should like, if you will let me, to keep a house in which there are small men and great men in equal numbers, and small women, and a boy of 6, who is at this moment in the kitchen eating his 5th roll, and any other small or great person who is, by happenstance of birth or by accident of arrival, in any way necessary to it. I should like, in the keeping of that house, to have you beside me. I should like to call Thomas Whitford my son in such fashion as the Church and the law and the regiment and the Bishop of York will permit me. He paused. He did not, for one breath, take his eyes from hers. I am asking you to marry me, Sarah, if you will. I know it has been 6 days. I have known you, on the inside of my chest, since Tuesday at 1:20. I shall not ask the question a second time. If you say no, I shall send for the dowager's carriage and set you and Thomas down in any town in England you choose, with the annuity already in your name, and I shall not trouble you again. If you say yes, you will, I hope, find me steady. I have had, at 28, a great deal more practice at standing still than at speaking. Will you, please? Mrs. Sarah Whitford, widow of Captain James Whitford of the 23rd Foot, did not answer at once. She set her free hand, very gently, against the locket at her throat. She closed her eyes for one moment. She opened them. She said, Your Grace. Sarah. Adrian. It was the first time, in any room of the house, he had heard his own name from her. He did not move. He held her right hand in both of his. He waited. She had been a captain's wife, she told him, and a widow, and a mother, and for 3 years an under-housemaid. She had not, in any of those years, been asked a question of this shape. She lifted her free hand to the locket chain and held it. She did not know how to answer well. She knew only that she would answer truthfully. She would not weep. She had not wept in 11 years, and she would not begin now. But he must permit her, for a moment only, to say that the man whose hair was in the locket had been the kindest man she would ever know, and that she had not expected to be asked a question of this shape, by any man living. The locket rose and fell once. The question, she said, had been asked in such a manner that she was very much obliged to him for the asking of it. She would like, if she might, to keep the locket, and to keep also, if it was agreeable to him, the small note his housekeeper had brought to her on the Thursday by candle. She would not, by the keeping of either, love him the less. She would, if anything, and she did not say this lightly, love him the more. He inclined his head. He did not interrupt. He did not let go of her hand. She had looked at him, she said, on the back stairs, and in the corridor, and in the morning room, and in the dining room doorway, since the Tuesday afternoon, since the cheese and the rule. She did not know exactly when she had begun to look. She knew only that she had been looking. She would, with his permission, go on looking. Yes, Adrian. I shall marry you. Yes. In the corner of the small green saloon, the Dowager Duchess of Wexford, 73 years old, possessed of the manners of a woman who had not, in any decade, been outmaneuvered, closed her gloved hand once around the curl of her cane, very tightly, and pretended, with very great civility, that the small, clear catch she had made at the back of her throat had been nothing more than a small impatience with the lateness of the tea. The Duke of Wexford, who had not for 11 years done anything that a duke was not strictly required to do in the manner he had been taught, lifted Mrs. Whitford's right hand to his mouth and pressed his lips, very gently and very gravely, to the back of the knuckle of her smallest finger. He did not speak. He could not. He did not need to. He set her hand back in her lap. He stood. He went to the door. He opened it. "Mrs. Linton," he said, into the empty corridor that was not, in fact, empty. "Your Grace," said Mrs. Linton, who had been waiting for some time on the other side of it with the tray. "You may bring the tea. And Master Whitford." "Yes, Your Grace. Master Whitford is in some way, Your Grace, currently engaged with his 6th role." "He shall bring it with him, Mrs. Linton. Tell him the rule is changed." "Yes, Your Grace. He knows." Thomas Whitford came in 3 minutes later with a saffron roll in his small fist. He stopped in the doorway when he saw the 3 faces in the saloon and the way his mother was holding her hand. He did not, yet, understand. He looked at the Duke. The Duke looked back at him. The Duke lowered himself, very gently, to one knee on the carpet, the way one lowers oneself for a young soldier or a small horse. "Thomas. Sir, your mother has, this afternoon, agreed to marry me. We shall be a family. You shall be my son, by every law of the Church and the regiment and the Bishop of York that I can arrange, and by the law of this house, from this hour. Are you agreeable to this?" Thomas considered. He considered with the great seriousness of his 6 years. He took one slow, careful bite of his saffron roll. He chewed. He swallowed. He set the roll down on the small green sofa very precisely, and laid both his small hands flat against the lap of his breeches. "Sir, yes, sir. I am very agreeable. May I tell Mrs. Linton?" "You may, Thomas." "And, sir, may I tell the under-butler? He was very kind to me on the Tuesday." "You may tell every member of the household, Thomas, in any order. You may even, if you like, tell the rooks." "Sir," said Thomas. "Thank you, sir. I shall." He picked up his saffron roll. He went very gravely out of the small green saloon at a pace appropriate to the bearing of a great announcement. The Dowager, in the corner, made another very small, clear catch at the back of her throat, which she did not, in this household, ever afterwards acknowledge. The Duke of Wexford pressed his thumb against the signet ring on his left hand. He did not press it in apprehension. He pressed it in the slow, steady way of a man who had at last, after 22 years, found a thing in his own house to be entirely glad of. They were married on the 18th of December in the parish church of Wexford-le-Moors. The dowager sat in the front pew, Mrs. Linton in the pew behind. Mr. Brent, the under-butler, held a basket of saffron rolls just outside the porch for the children of the village. Thomas Whitford acted as the only attendant, in a small, dark blue jacket, whose elbow had been repatched for the occasion. Mr. Pellet, the magistrate, stood as one of the witnesses, and Henry Sefton, who had come north from Cumbria with his Eleanor and the children, because his elder brother had written to ask him to, as the other. The Bishop of York performed the service. He had read the magistrate's note. He had read the court journal paragraph in which Captain Whitford had been named. He performed the service slowly, with the courtesy of a man who had been moved by something he had not expected to be moved by. And at the moment in which he was required to pronounce the Duke and the new Duchess man and wife, he set one hand for a moment, almost without thinking, on the small, fair head of the boy, who was standing between them with a saffron roll wrapped in a clean handkerchief in his pocket against the cold. That evening, in the morning room with the curtains drawn against the December wind, the new Duchess of Wexford sat on the window seat with her son on one side and her husband on the other, and read aloud the 7th and 8th and 9th of Henry Sefton's letters from Spain. The locket at her throat lay open against her collar. The framed letter in plain oak hung above the writing desk. The fire was warm. Mrs. Linton, who had brought up a tray of saffron rolls and a jug of milk for the boy, paused in the doorway as she withdrew, looked once at the 3 figures on the window seat, and went away down the corridor without making a sound. In the kitchen, Davy the stable boy's grandson, who was 9 and who was, by long-standing village tradition and by the strict new rules of the house, permitted to ask for anything he wanted at any hour, was eating a saffron roll on the corner of the deal table, swinging his legs, and being given by the second cook a precise account of the morning Thomas Whitford had been pulled out from beneath the south dining-room table by the present Duke, and of what had been done about it, and of what had been done about the rule which had put him there. The corridor outside the morning room was long and warm, and lit by candles which Mrs. Linton had ordered for that wing in fresh wax that morning, and was, for the first time in 22 years, a corridor in which the children of the house were permitted, at any hour, to run. A year and a fortnight after the 18th of December, in the green and gold light of an early March afternoon, with the snow gone at last from the long lawn, and the first crocuses showing under the limes, and a thrush singing in the espaliered pears, as if he had not been told that winter was meant to last longer in Yorkshire. The Duke of Wexford was walking on the gravel drive with his wife and his son. Thomas was 7 now. He had grown 2 inches. He had read, by his own count, 3 of the 5 books on the window seat in the morning room. He carried, on this particular afternoon, his father's Spanish primer, the one which had been kept in tissue, and which had been given to him on the morning after the wedding, in the deep pocket of his small new coat. He was, by general agreement of the household, the best-tempered boy in 3 parishes. He had not, in 14 months, hidden under a table. The Duchess walked between her husband and her son. She had her hand through Adrian's arm. The locket at her throat had been opened, on the morning after the wedding, to add to its careful papers the bishop's printed marriage line, which the Duke had folded very small and given to her at the door of the morning room, with a small, precise bow that he had practiced in the corridor for some hours. The locket no longer needed her thumb to close. She had, in the course of the year, also added, by her husband's persuasion and with her own consent, a small lock of his fair sand hair, cut by Mrs. Linton with the kitchen scissors on the morning of the wedding, beside the dark lock of her late husband's. She wore the locket, as she had always worn it, against her collar. She had, in the course of the year, also wept 3 times, once at the wedding, once at Christmas, when Thomas had been given his first pony, and once on the morning in February, when Mrs. Linton had brought her tea and told her, with great pleasure and at some length, that there would be, by the autumn, a second child in the nursery, whose existence the Duchess had, by Mrs. Linton's eye, not yet entirely realized. She had not, in any of those weepings, been ashamed of them. The Duke pressed his thumb, very gently, against the signet ring on his left hand. He pressed it in the slow, steady way of a man taking a measurement of a thing he was content with. He had pressed it, in this fashion, 3 or 4 times a day for 14 months. At the corner of the gravel drive, where the avenue of limes turned toward the kitchen wall, Thomas paused. He pulled the Spanish primer out of his pocket. He set his small finger on a line. "Papa," he said, "I have a word." "Yes, Thomas?" "It is the word for thank you." "Is it?" "Gracias, Papa. It is gracias. I asked Mamma yesterday evening. She said it was the right word. She said, Papa, she said—" Thomas hesitated, and then, with the careful precision of a 7-year-old soldier reporting to a colonel, "She said Papa James used it every day, sir. Every day to the men of the company. Gracias, she said, he said. I should like to use it also." "You shall use it, Thomas." "Papa." "Yes." "Gracias, Papa." "For what, Thomas?" Thomas considered. He looked at his mother, and at the long lawn, and at the limes, and at the kitchen wall over which a thin curl of saffron-scented steam was rising from the proving pans inside. He said, very seriously, "Papa, for all of it. For the table, for the rule, for the second book, for Mama, for Mrs. Linton, for the kitchen, for the morning room, for the locket, for the pony, for the rooks, for the saffron rolls, for—" He stopped. He looked very gravely up at his father. "For all of it, Papa. I do not know, yet, the Spanish for all. But it is all." The Duke of Wexford set his hand for a moment on the small, fair head of his son. He did not, on this occasion, speak. He did not need to. The Duchess, at his arm, did not speak either. The thrush sang once again in the espaliered pears. A small wind moved in the limes. From the kitchen wall, faintly, came the sound of Mrs. Linton humming the way her mother had hummed when she was rolling out pastry, 23 years ago, on a Wednesday afternoon, in front of a boy of 6 who had been told, that afternoon, that a duke's house was for great men and not for small ones. The boy of 6 had been very wrong, the Duke understood now, only in the matter of the rule. The house had been, all along, for everyone.